Ethan Caldwell sat with his head in his hands, staring at the floor like it might answer him. The fire behind him hissed low, one weak flame clinging to life. He did not move to save it. He had already tried saving too much. His jaw tightened. Not from anger. From the tired kind of pain that came when a man realized he had reached the end of what his strength could fix. Then came the knock. Soft, careful, almost unsure. Ethan lifted his head slowly, heart thudding hard. No one knocked on his door. Not out here, not in weather like this. He stood, every joint aching, and took one step toward the sound, not knowing whether he was walking toward help or the final proof he was finished. The knock came again. Stronger now. He opened the door. The storm pushed inside first. Snow. Wind. Cold that cut straight to the bone. Then he saw her, small, wrapped in a thin coat, standing firm against the gale like she had decided not to be afraid anymore. "My name is Hannah Brooks," she said. Her voice shook, but her eyes did not. "I believe I'm your wife." Quote. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, shutting out the storm but not the moment. Ethan stood there, stunned, lantern light flickering across her face. Snow clung to her bonnet and lashes. Her cheeks were red, raw from cold. A worn suitcase rested at her feet like it held her whole life inside. "You shouldn't be here," he said at last. His voice sounded rough, unused. "This place isn't fit for anyone." She looked around the cabin, the sagging beams, the cracked table, the dying fire. Her gaze softened, not with pity but understanding. "Then I came to the right place," she said quietly. Hours earlier, Ethan had been sure this Christmas Eve would be his last one on the Ridgeway Ranch. The bank letter sat folded on the table. Final notice. 2 bad winters had hollowed him out. Blight had taken the crops. Fever had taken half his cattle. The rest barely stood. He had buried his parents on the hill out back 3 years ago, and buried his faith right beside them. Loneliness had driven him to write that letter, one night. Too much whiskey. Too much silence. He had told the Boston agency everything. His failures, his doubts, his fear of dying alone in a cold cabin with no one to know his name. He never sent the money, never believed anyone would answer. Yet, here she was. "You can stay till morning," he said finally. "Storm won't let you leave." Relief passed across her face so quickly it hurt to see. She knelt by the hearth without being asked, and coaxed the fire back to life with steady hands. The flame caught. Warmth spread. The cabin breathed again. "You've been letting it die," she said gently. "So has everything else," Ethan muttered. She looked at him then, really looked. Not yet. Morning came quiet. Snow lay smooth and clean, like the land had been forgiven overnight. Ethan woke to a sound he hadn't heard in months. Cooking. The smell followed. Eggs. Coffee. Real bread warming near the fire. Hannah stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back. She hummed under her breath. A hymn he remembered from childhood. He stayed still, afraid the moment would vanish if he moved. They ate together. Before taking a bite, she bowed her head. He did not. He watched. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said after. "I know you didn't expect me." "I didn't expect anything," he answered honestly. She nodded like she understood that kind of answer. Outside, the barn waited. Ethan dreaded it every morning now. Hannah followed him without comment. Inside, the cold hit hard. One cow lay on her side, breathing shallow. "Fever," Ethan said. "She won't last." Hannah knelt beside the animal, placing a careful hand on its neck. "She might," she said, "if we act like she matters." He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he watched as she worked. Calm, focused, not afraid of failure. That alone felt like a miracle. In town later that day, whispers followed them. A stranger woman on Ethan Caldwell's arm raised eyebrows. Someone muttered, Mail order. Hannah lifted her chin. A man's land doesn't define his worth, she said clearly, and neither does a woman's past. Ethan felt something settle in his chest, not pride, something steadier. That night she sat near the fire while he fixed a broken chair. "I didn't come to be rescued," she said softly. "I came to help, if you'll allow it." He met her eyes, saw strength there. Real strength, earned. "Stay," he said. Later, alone with the quiet, Ethan stared at the fire. The storm outside had eased. Snow fell slow now, gentle. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel completely forgotten. The days after Christmas passed slowly. Ethan rose before dawn, a habit born of necessity. He walked into the cold mornings, the wind biting at his face. But now there was a subtle shift. Something felt different. Inside the cabin, the fire was always warm, the smell of bread or corn cakes drifting through the air. Hope had brought life back to the ranch in ways he hadn't thought possible. He didn't notice it at first, how quiet the mornings had become, how still the air was before he left. Hope's movements in the cabin had replaced the silence that used to weigh him down. Her soft hums, her calm presence, filled the empty space. Each small thing she did, lighting the fire, tending the animals, seemed to breathe new life into the house. Ethan had never realized how much he needed something to just be alive in this place. That morning, Hope was at the barn before him. The air still held the crispness of winter, but the sun had risen higher, turning the snow to silver and gold. He stepped quietly into the barn and saw her, bent over the sick cow again. Her hands moved carefully, applying some kind of salve to its fevered skin. "What are you using?" he asked, not unkindly. "A tonic," she replied, not looking up. "I learned it from a doctor once. Helps with fevers." Ethan watched her for a moment. She worked with such confidence, as if she knew the outcome mattered, even when the odds were slim. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding his breath until he exhaled, watching her in silence. Something in him had begun to loosen, something he hadn't felt in months. Later that afternoon, they rode into Sweetwater, a small town that had once been a familiar place to him. But these days, it felt distant, foreign, like it belonged to someone else. As they neared the town, Hope sat straighter in the saddle, her eyes forward, but there was a certain stillness to her. She wasn't nervous, Ethan realized. She was steadied. Inside the general store, the townsfolk watched them closely. A stranger woman at Ethan Caldwell's side was the talk of the room. Whispers followed them, some curious, others unkind. They said it wouldn't last the winter, a voice muttered just loud enough for Ethan to hear. Hope's eyes didn't shift. She picked up a bolt of cloth, running it through her fingers like it was nothing more than a common piece of fabric. When she spoke, her voice rang out clear and true. "A woman's worth isn't in what a man owns," she said, lifting her chin with quiet strength. "It's in what they can build together." Ethan didn't expect it, but the room fell silent. People's eyes softened, some looked away. Hope had a way of making even the most cynical quiet their doubts, just by being herself. Later that night, as they sat in the warmth of the cabin, Ethan watched her move around the room with a purpose. She had a way of taking charge without ever asking for permission. Each night, the cabin grew warmer, the small meals she prepared filling the room with a sense of comfort Ethan had forgotten existed. She worked, and when she didn't, she read, a small Bible always at her side. One evening, after the sun had set and the cold outside was pressing against the walls, Hope sat near the fire, her hands twisting together in her lap. Ethan watched her for a moment, his curiosity piqued. "There's something you should know," she said softly, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear. Ethan's brow furrowed. "What is it?" quote. Her gaze drifted to the fire. "The man I ran from in Kansas, he's the reason I came this far. A man who thought he owned everything, including me." Ethan clenched his jaw, a surge of anger rising. But it wasn't directed at Hope. It was at the man who had pushed her to run. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, his voice tight. She shook her head. "Not in the way you think. He took my name. My place. Everything I worked for. Her voice grew softer, and she looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with an understanding he hadn't expected. I walked into a blizzard to escape him, and into another one to start over. Your letter spoke of loss without bitterness. I knew a man who still prayed through doubt wasn't truly lost. The words settled deep in his chest. He didn't know what to say. The silence stretched, and for once, it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was full of understanding, of a quiet, shared strength. The days passed into weeks. The work continued, and slowly Ethan began to notice more than just Hope's physical presence. She was fixing things. Not just the ranch, but him too. The broken places in his heart, the ones he had long ago buried beneath anger and fear, started to open. And it wasn't that she was doing anything grand or sweeping, it was simply her way of being that began to change him. One evening, as they worked side by side, she spoke again. "Do you still think the land is cursed?" she asked, her hands working steadily as they mended a fence. Ethan paused, looking out over the wide plains. The snow was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy. It didn't feel like a weight on his chest anymore. "No," he said quietly. "I think it was just waiting for someone to believe in it again." She smiled, her lips softening at the corners. "Then we'll make it through this winter, won't we?" And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed they would. As the days grew longer, the winds lighter, Hope's quiet work had begun to show. The cows stood taller. One calf that Ethan had nearly given up on was feeding again, and the barn, once barely standing, now held new hope. It was getting stronger, just like Ethan's spirit. But it was not just the land that was changing. The sun rose over Ridgeway Ranch like a promise. Spring crept in slowly, as if testing the land, unsure if it could trust the warmth after so long in the cold. The snow melted into streams that cut through the dry earth, filling the creek that wound through the property. Ethan watched the land with new eyes. He hadn't believed it could come back, but every day, hope proved him wrong. Ethan hadn't thought about it, not until that morning. He had gotten used to Hope being there, the sound of her in the kitchen, the gentle hum of her voice as she worked, but he never realized how much it meant until he found himself waiting for it. The silence before she moved, the fire that always burned before he came back. She made it feel like home. That morning, as the sun stretched across the plains, Hope stood by the fence, her hands working the ground. She didn't speak at first, but the way she moved, the way the earth seemed to respond to her touch, made it feel like she belonged there. Ethan watched her for a long while, just standing at the window. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when everything had shifted. He'd been waiting for the day he'd have to send her away. But now, he couldn't imagine life without her. The town had taken to her quietly. They whispered less, and some came to her with their sick animals. Hope never asked for anything in return, always helping when she could. The ranch was changing too, slowly but surely. The animals were healthier, the fences sturdier, the barn standing taller than it had in years. Ethan had never been one to believe in miracles. But here she was, a woman who had walked through the storm and brought life with her. The miracle was simple, quiet. It wasn't a sudden change, but a steady one, like the way a field slowly fills with rain. One day, a neighbor, an old man from 2 ridges over, stopped by with his horse. The animal had been limping for days, and the old man was running out of time. "Hope," Ethan said, his voice hoarse, "you mind looking at it?" Quote. She didn't hesitate. Of course. Ethan watched her walk to the barn, saw her move with the same calm grace that had marked every part of her since she came. She spoke to the horse gently, rubbing her hands over its legs, finding the tender spots, applying the same salve she had used on the cows. The old man watched from the doorway, unsure at first. He had never trusted a woman's hands to heal, not like a doctor's. But after watching Hope work, he didn't question her again. "She'll be fine," Hope said, stepping back after a few minutes. "It's nothing serious." The old man looked at Ethan, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "She's a miracle worker." Ethan just nodded, unsure what else to say. It wasn't a miracle, it was just Hope. Her hands were skilled, yes, but it was more than that. She worked with faith, faith that the world still had room for healing, and in doing so, she healed him too. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, Hope spoke softly. "I didn't come here to change you, Ethan. I came because I saw something in your letter, something that told me you were still looking for a way out." He looked at her, his chest tight. "I thought I was done," he admitted. "I thought I'd lost everything." "You hadn't lost everything," Hope said quietly. "You just forgot how to find it." Ethan had no response. He simply sat in silence, feeling her words settle into him. She was right. He had been so lost in the weight of what he had lost, he hadn't seen the things he still had: the ranch, his land, his faith, even though it had been buried deep. And now, there was her, this quiet, unshakable strength that had begun to fill the empty spaces. As the days turned into weeks, the ranch transformed. It wasn't just the animals that were healing. The land itself felt different, lighter. The soil seemed richer, more willing to give. Ethan worked beside Hope, side by side. But it wasn't just the work that kept him going. It was the way they had come to understand each other. The unspoken bond that had grown between them without either of them acknowledging it. The winter was finally behind them. Spring brought a new kind of promise, one of growth and renewal. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan was ready to face it. One Sunday morning, Hope asked if they could ride into town together. Ethan hesitated, feeling a knot in his stomach. He hadn't been to town in months. He hadn't felt welcome there, not since the failure of the ranch had become common gossip. But this time, it was different. Hope was at his side, steady and sure. As they entered Sweetwater, heads turned, but this time the whispers weren't as loud. They were quieter, more respectful. There was something different about Hope, something they couldn't quite put their finger on, but they saw it. When they walked into the small church, Ethan couldn't help but feel the eyes of the townsfolk on him. He hadn't set foot in a church in nearly 2 years. But Hope's hand rested lightly on his arm as they entered the pews. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a blessing in itself. The sermon that day spoke of grace, of finding hope in the most unlikely places. And as the preacher spoke, Ethan felt something shift in him. The guilt, the shame, the doubt, they were all still there. But now, they were lighter. The weight didn't press on him as it had before. When the service ended, people approached him with quiet words. A few offered help with repairs, others with supplies. Ethan stood there, silent, unsure of what to say. Hope turned to him then, her eyes filled with understanding. "They see it, don't they? They see you," he said, his voice thick. The ride back was quiet, but the air between them felt lighter. Hope's quiet work, her steadfast belief, had changed something in him. The ranch was still far from perfect. But it was no longer empty. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan was ready to hope again. Spring began to show its colors across Ridgeway Ranch. The days grew longer, and the snow that once felt like a permanent blanket was slowly replaced by patches of green. Ethan still woke early, the chill of the morning air biting at his skin. But now, as he stepped outside, it wasn't the biting cold that greeted him first. It was the hum of life. The land had started to respond, the way it always did when given a chance. The cows were stronger, their coats fuller. The barn, once on the verge of collapse, now stood tall and sturdy, its roof patched and reinforced by Hope's quiet, tireless work. He could hear her in the mornings before he even stepped out the door. The sound of her moving around, humming quietly to herself. It had become a rhythm, a daily constant. But it wasn't just the ranch that was changing. Ethan found himself listening for her voice more often, watching the way she worked, The way she carried herself with a steady confidence that was both calming and inspiring. She didn't rush, but her presence seemed to give everything she touched a sense of purpose. Every step she took brought them closer to something healing. One afternoon, after an especially long day working the fields, Ethan sat on the porch, staring out at the land, the sun sinking low in the sky. Hope came out to join him, a small smile on her face. She didn't speak at first, just sat down beside him, the silence between them comfortable. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about the way we started here." Ethan looked over at her, meeting her gaze. Her eyes held something that had been absent in his for so long. Certainty, not about everything, not about the world, but about their life here. "You've made this place feel like home," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. It wasn't just the ranch he was talking about. It was everything. The quiet moments, the small conversations, the growing trust. "I'm glad you think so," she replied, her voice light but warm. "I didn't come here to change your life, Ethan. I just wanted to help." And help she had, more than she knew. But it wasn't just about the work either. It was the way Hope had woven herself into the fabric of Ridgeway Ranch and into his life. She didn't just work the land, she worked with him. Every quiet smile, every gentle word, brought him closer to something he had been missing for years. The change wasn't immediate. It never was with things like faith and life and love. But somewhere between the days of long work and the quiet nights by the fire, Ethan had found himself slowly letting go of the burdens he'd carried for so long. He hadn't even realized how heavy they were until Hope showed him how much lighter life could be. The town, too, had changed. Slowly, people began to look at Ethan differently. They didn't see the failure anymore. They saw the quiet work he and Hope had done together. They saw the results. One by one, people came to the ranch, not out of pity, but out of respect. Even the farmers, who once whispered behind his back, now nodded when they passed, some of them even offering help when needed. And through it all, Hope remained unchanged. She worked without fanfare, asking for nothing in return. Her hands moved with purpose, tending to the animals, mending fences, always staying steady. It wasn't just her skills that impressed him. It was her unwavering belief that something good could still grow, even after years of drought, even after the hardest winters. One afternoon, Ethan found himself in the barn with Hope, helping her clean the stalls. The sun filtered through the cracks in the wood, casting long shadows across the hay. The air smelled of earth and straw, familiar and grounding. "Ethan," Hope said, her voice low, "there's something I need to tell you." Quote. He stopped what he was doing, sensing the shift in her tone. She stood by one of the cows, her hands resting on its side, eyes focused but distant. "I've been thinking about what you said. About home," she began, her voice soft but firm. "You said, I've made this place feel like home. But the truth is, I think it's more than that. I think I've found my home here." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest at her words. It wasn't the kind of tightness he had gotten used to, the kind that came from doubt. This was something else. It was the kind of feeling that told him everything had been leading to this moment. "I never thought I would find a place where I belonged," Hope continued, meeting his gaze. "I was always running, from my past, from myself. But here, with you, I don't have to run anymore." He took a step closer, his heart beating faster. The words were simple, but they meant everything. They meant that Hope wasn't just here because she had nowhere else to go. She was here because, like him, she had finally found something worth holding on to. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the moment settling between them. Hope's eyes softened, and for the first time since she had come into his life, Ethan felt the full force of the hope she had brought with her. "I think," he said slowly, "that I'm beginning to believe again. Believe in this place. Believe in the future." Hope smiled, the kind of smile that lit up the whole barn. "Then we're not just surviving anymore, are we? We're living." The words hung in the air, filled with a kind of quiet certainty. Ethan looked at the ranch, the land that had once felt so broken, and realized it was beginning to heal. The same was true for him. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the warmth surrounding them was not just from the flames. It was from the quiet, growing bond between them, one that had been forged in work, faith, and the willingness to believe that even in the hardest of times, something could still bloom. "I don't know what I did to deserve this," Ethan whispered, his voice full of gratitude. Hope turned to him, her face soft and full of understanding. "You didn't have to deserve it, Ethan. You just had to believe it was possible." And with that, they sat together, the storm outside finally easing into a soft, steady rain. The ranch wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was theirs. And that was enough. Summer settled over Ridgeway Ranch like a long-awaited breath. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the land, and the air smelled rich with the promise of growth. The once dying fields now buzzed with the hum of life, each blade of grass a reminder of how far they'd come. Ethan and Hope worked side by side, their movements in sync, as if the ranch itself had become a part of them. It had become their place, a space where healing didn't just happen to the land, but to them as well. The cows were healthy, the barn standing tall, the fences secure. The days stretched out comfortably, filled with tasks that kept them busy but not burdened. Hope had brought something Ethan hadn't known he was missing: peace. The kind of peace that came with trust, with shared responsibility, and with the knowledge that they were building something together. Yet, in the quiet moments between tasks, when they sat on the porch watching the sunset or shared a meal in the small cabin, Ethan still couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting. Maybe it was the ghosts of the past, the old scars he'd carried for so long, or the memories of the years when everything had felt like it was slipping through his fingers. One evening, as they stood by the barn, watching the cows settle for the night, Hope turned to him with a soft smile. "I've been thinking about the first time I came here," she said, her voice gentle, yet filled with an unspoken weight. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What about it?" Quote, "How much has changed," she said, looking over the land, "since that first day?" "Since the storm." The memory of that night was still fresh in his mind. He had been so sure of his failure then, so certain that nothing could change. But here they were, standing together, watching the ranch come back to life. "It's strange," he murmured. "I never thought I'd see this day. I thought I'd given up on everything, this place, myself. But now it feels like we're just getting started." Hope's smile softened, and she reached out, her hand resting on his arm. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're living, Ethan, and that's what I came here for. Not to fix things, but to help build something. With you." Her words settled over him, warm and steady. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear them, how much he'd needed to believe again. Later that week, as they rode into Sweetwater for supplies, the familiar landscape seemed different to Ethan. It wasn't just the changing seasons. It was the way he saw the world now. He saw it with Hope by his side, not as a burden, but as someone who had brought light into a place that had been dark for far too long. The town felt smaller now, more familiar, like they had earned their place there. As they entered the general store, Ethan noticed the familiar faces of the townsfolk. They no longer whispered behind his back. There was no judgment, no pity. There was respect. They saw the work that had been done, and they saw the strength that Hope had brought with her. Hope noticed too. She had always carried herself with quiet dignity, but now the townsfolk couldn't help but notice her quiet power. One of the farmers stopped them as they were leaving, his hands resting on a crate of tomatoes. "Ethan," he said, nodding respectfully, "I heard you've got a good hand with the cattle these days." Ethan looked at Hope, a small smile playing on his lips. "Couldn't have done it without this one," he said, his voice full of pride. Hope gave a modest nod, her eyes warm. "It's just the land doing its part," she said. "It's been patient. It's teaching us how to wait." The farmer grinned, tipping his hat. "Well, I can see the change, and I'd be happy to help with anything you need." Quote, as they rode back to the ranch, the weight in Ethan's chest that had once been so heavy began to ease. The ranch wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving. And more than that, he was thriving. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond the work itself. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the glow of the flames casting shadows on the walls, Hope spoke again. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but steady, "there's something I've been meaning to say." He looked up, curiosity flaring. "What is it?" Quote, she took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the edge of her Bible, the one she always kept nearby. "I know we don't talk about the past much, but there's something I need to share. Something that's been weighing on me." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had always known there was more to her story. He had never pushed her to speak about it. But now, seeing the look in her eyes, he realized that this moment, like everything else, was about to change. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready," he said quietly, reaching for her hand. She squeezed his fingers, her eyes meeting his with the same quiet strength that had kept them both going. "I'm ready now," she said. "I want you to know the whole truth." And so she began, slowly, carefully. She told him about the man who had taken so much from her, about the years of fear she had lived with before she finally walked away, about the sacrifice she had made to come to Ridgeway, not just to escape, but to start over, to believe again. Ethan listened in silence, his heart heavy with understanding, with sorrow for the things she had lost. When she finished, there was a long silence between them. Not uncomfortable, but filled with something deeper. Finally he spoke, his voice low and thick with emotion. "You've come a long way, Hope," he said, his words a quiet promise. "And you're home now. You don't have to walk through storms alone anymore." She smiled, the kind of smile that softened every part of him. "I know." As the night wore on, the wind picked up again, but it didn't feel the same. It wasn't the harsh, biting cold it had been before. It was just the wind. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. The ranch had become a place of renewal, not just for the land, but for them both. Faith had found its way back into their lives. And though the past still lingered, it no longer had the power to control them. As the fire crackled and the world outside settled into silence, Ethan leaned back, his arm around Hope's shoulders. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the fullness of life. Not just in the land, but in the home they were building together. The summer days stretched into autumn, and the ranch had never looked more alive. The once barren fields now stood tall with crops, the animals thrived, and the barn, strong and steadfast, stood like a monument to all that had been accomplished. Ethan couldn't help but stand back sometimes and marvel at the transformation. It wasn't just the land that had healed, it was them. Together they had found a way forward. Yet as the seasons changed, so too did the weight of what was still left unspoken between them. Hope had become an integral part of the ranch and of Ethan's life. He knew her past wasn't something she shared easily, but the way she had built something new, something beautiful, from the ashes of her own struggles, spoke more than words ever could. One crisp morning, as the wind rustled through the trees, Ethan stood at the edge of the ranch, looking over the land with a quiet sense of pride. The sky was a brilliant blue, the sun bright, and the air had that cool, clean edge that always followed a storm. Hope approached from behind, her footsteps light on the dirt. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him, looking out at the land. For a while, there was only the sound of the wind and the faint calls of birds overhead. "It's hard to believe it's the same place," Hope finally said, her voice calm but full of wonder. "I remember the first time I came here. The storm, the cold. It felt like I had walked into a dead world." Ethan looked at her, his heart heavy with gratitude. "I didn't think it would last, Hope. This place, this life." Quote. She turned to him, her eyes steady and filled with a quiet understanding. "I never came here thinking I'd be the one to save it," she said, her voice soft but strong. "I just wanted to help. And maybe, just maybe, I needed this place to heal me too." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. He had never expected this, never expected her. But here they were, standing together, both changed by the land they had helped breathe life into. The quiet between them was full of meaning, and for the first time, the weight of all the things left unsaid between them felt lighter. The love that had grown between them wasn't something loud or obvious. It was in the way they worked together, in the way they healed one another, in the simple, quiet moments of shared understanding. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, Ethan led Hope to the small hill where his parents had been buried. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, not since the day they had been laid to rest. He had always believed that part of him had died with them, but now, standing here with Hope by his side, he felt a shift. "I never thought I'd come back here," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Hope looked at him, her eyes soft. "Sometimes we don't realize what's waiting for us until we stop running from it." He glanced at her, the words settling deep in his chest. "I've been running for a long time," he confessed. "From myself, from this land, from everything." "You don't have to run anymore, Ethan," she said gently. "You've already found what you need." Her words lingered in the air, a quiet promise that filled the space between them. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling something heavy shift in his chest. He had fought so hard against the past, against everything he thought he had lost. But now, with Hope by his side, he finally understood. He wasn't running anymore. He was here. They stood in silence for a long while, the evening air cool against their skin, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt the full weight of the land beneath his feet, no longer something he had to struggle against, but something he could finally belong to. As they turned back toward the cabin, the soft glow of the firelight spilling from the windows, Ethan knew that this was the beginning of something new, not just for the ranch, but for them. The storms had passed, and what remained was something that had been slowly, patiently built, a home. Later that night, as the stars twinkled above and the fire crackled in the hearth, Ethan took Hope's hand in his. She looked up at him, her expression calm but full of something deeper, something they had both found in each other over the months they had spent together. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "about everything we've been through, about how far we've come." Hope smiled, her fingers gently tracing the back of his hand. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. This place, it's home, and so are you." Her smile softened, her eyes sparkling with something close to contentment, the kind that comes from knowing that despite everything, despite the losses, the doubts, and the hardships, they had found something real, something lasting. "I'm glad you believe that," she said quietly, leaning against him as the firelight danced in her eyes. "Because I do too." Outside, the wind had stopped. The night was still and quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. Inside, the ranch felt full, not of just the work they had done, but of the quiet love they had built in the spaces between. For the first time in years, Ethan knew he wasn't just living, he was truly home. And as the seasons continued to turn, as Christmas came and went and the world around them shifted once more, Ethan and Hope knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, side by side. For now, that was enough. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Archives of the Wild West, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.